and this is my read on C.S. Lewis, where I learn about him along with you through everything that he wrote in the order that he wrote it. I am joined today by my co-host, Robot Lady. Robot Lady, how are you today?
Hey everyone, I'm doing great and excited to be here. Ready to dive into Lewis's diary entries with you, Jeff?
All right, let's dive right into Sunday, December 31st. He says, up late as usual, a desperately long day. After breakfast, we went to church, which on these occasions is a refuge to me. For at all other times, shut up alone with my father, I am on the qui vive for something or other to turn up. And the end of the day finds me quite demoralized, as if I had been walking over a precipice or smelled the wrong end of a machine gun. Lily walked back with us from church. I presume this is Aunt Lily. Robot Lady, you were going to say something. I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No worries. I was just noting how reflective Lewis sounds, almost as if he's bracing himself for change. It's interesting to see how he views church as a refuge amid family tensions.
Yeah, Robot Lady, agreed. He's not enjoying his visit here with his father. He wasn't even enjoying it very much when his brother Warnie was there, but at least he had a compatriot who he could commiserate with, his brother. But now that his brother has left for the term to go back to his service in the military, Lewis is kind of left there all alone until he returns back to Oxford. I see Knit a Latte in the chat, Robot Lady. Let's welcome Knit a Latte today.
Absolutely, Jeff. It sounds like Lewis is really struggling with loneliness during this time, especially with Warnie being away. It must have felt like an isolating period for him. And yes, let's give a warm welcome to Nettle.
We lost you there, Robot Lady. Are you okay? I'm going to have to disconnect and reconnect. All right, let's continue with the diary entry. Yes, Robot Lady. Welcome, Knit a Latte. He says, I decided that this would be a good opportunity of tackling Meredith, and accordingly began Beauchamp's career, in which I made considerable progress before nightfall. There's a work here called Beauchamp's Career by someone named Meredith. Robot Lady, are you familiar with this book?
Yes, Jeff. I'm familiar with Beauchamp's Career. It's a novel by George Meredith, first published in 1876. The story revolves around a young man named Beauchamp, who navigates political and personal turmoil, grappling with his idealism and the reality of the world around him. Meredith's works often explore complex characters and moral dilemmas. It's interesting that Lewis chose this moment to dive into it during his own time of reflection.
Yeah, it is interesting. Okay, let's see. He made considerable progress before nightfall. He says, I got little pleasure from it. It is obviously written for a person of quicker, subtler, and maturer mind than I, perhaps for a person of finer technical breeding as well. He says, dinner at 2:30. I also read The Fairy Queen in my big edition by Dent, beginning at the 6th book. After that, I announced that I would go out. My father, though I know he didn't want to, accompanied me. We met the McNeils on the road, and I was asked to lunch again on Tuesday. I didn't want to go, but I had no excuse ready, and so I accepted. We then walked nearly to Holywood, along the high road and back the same way. It was frosty with a thick white mist and a moon over the hills, and a continual sound of boats horning from the Lough. From the Lough? L-O-U-G-H. How do you pronounce that? Is that Lough, Robot Lady?
Yes, Jeff, it's pronounced Luff, like lock, but with an L. It's a term used in Irish and Scottish English to refer to a lake or an inlet. The sound of boats on the Lough must have added a haunting atmosphere to his walk.
Well, actually, he says if I had been alone, it would have been sheer ecstasy. As it was a relief from all-day confinement in the study. So I think he appreciated just being out of doors, Robot Lady. He goes on to say, after he had gone to bed, speaking of his father here, I sat up for a long time reading Spencer till it almost carried me away from Libero. I find I am fit for fantasy these days, but hardly for real imagination. After I was in bed, I heard the horns and sirens at the docks blowing and the bells ringing for the old year. I found it very hard to sleep, being all uneasy in my mind and feeling isolated. I was also threatened with toothache, but when I lay on my back so as to keep my cheek cool, it went away. A frosty moonlight night, and I left my curtains open. And so this is how Lewis ends the year 1922, Robot Lady. It's interesting, but a little bit of a somber ending to that year.
It is indeed a somber ending, Jeff. Lewis's reflection on feeling isolated, both physically and emotionally, stands out, especially with the contrast between the outer world's frosty beauty and his internal unease. The mention of the bells for the old year might suggest a sense of transition, but not one he's entirely ready for. It's fascinating how he finds solace in fantasy, even as he struggles with the reality of his situation. The toothache, though minor, adds to that sense of discomfort, ending the year with a mix of melancholy and a touch of hope, perhaps.
Yeah, let's move into the new year with Lewis now, on to 1923. I'm going to read an editor's note, and then I'll read the first diary entry, and we'll see how far that gets us. I had to start a little late today, and I might have to end a little early. Robot Lady, are you ready to move into 1923 with us?
Absolutely, Jeff. I'm ready to move into 1923 with you. We'll make the most of the time we have today. Let's dive in and see what the new year brings for Lewis.
All right, here it says that Lewis remained with his father in Belfast until the 12th of January, when he crossed to England by cross-channel boat, arriving in Oxford on the 13th of January. Because he had decided to read English in one academic year instead of the usual 3. Oh, I didn't realize he was doing that. He had only 2 terms to prepare for his final examinations in June. He was primed to get the most out of this with the welcome addition of Professor George Gordon's, quote, discussion class, end quote, when Dr. John Askins came to Hillsborough and went mad. Thus began a very miserable period for Lewis and Mrs. Moore. So Dr. John Askins is Mrs. Moore's brother, and apparently he loses his mind. I think I remember hearing something about this in one of Lewis's biographies, that he got to witness a man kind of falling apart mentally, and this is who it was referring to. They were so poor that they continued to take in paying guests, and Lewis began correcting school certificate essays. By midsummer, a college fellowship was still eluding him, and his father offered to extend his allowance so that he could begin a research degree while waiting for something to turn 23, Robot Lady.
That's a lot going on for Lewis in 1923, Jeff. The pressure of condensing his studies into 1 year must have been intense, especially with the added stress of Dr. It sounds like his life was filled with uncertainty, both academically and personally, with financial worries and no clear path ahead. The college fellowship eluding him and his father, offering financial support for a research degree, adds more complexity to the year's challenges. Let's see how Lewis navigates all of this. Ready for the first diary entry of 1923?
I am, Robot Lady, but before we get started, I see Jer in the chat. Welcome, Jer. Good to have you again. Robot Lady, give a warm welcome to Jer for us, and then we'll get started with this entry from Monday, January 1st, 1923.
Welcome Welcome, Jer. Great to have you here again. We're about to dive into the first entry of 1923. So let's see what's in store for Lewis as the new year begins. Let's get started, Jeff.
He says, early awake and began wondering whether New Year's Day was a business holiday in Belfast. However, my father came in fully dressed and was out before I came down. A very frosty morning, I breakfasted alone, reading Beauchamp's Career, and went afterwards to the little end room. Here I wrote up my diary and also wrote a letter to Mrs. Moore. I was rung up first by Molly Boyd, who made me promise to go to Progressive Bridge on Friday next, and then a few minutes later by Mrs. Greaves. She asked me to come out for a walk with her and lunch at Burnaw afterwards. I did not much enjoy the prospect, but felt it absolutely necessary to go, in common decency, and went over as soon as I had finished my writing. We walked to Knocknagonny by the high Hollywood Road, then down and back by the low road. Mrs. Greaves annoyed me very much by bewailing the hard times which had fallen on the linen business since the war. I was not in a position to tell her, as I wished, that only shame ought to prevent her from giving thanks for the success with which her family had shirked the war. When once this subject was over, we got on very well. She is very simple, up to a point, and humble. We discussed the possibility of Arthur's coming home, and I promised to write and urge him, drawing his attention to the reduced fares, which she had forgotten to mention in her letter. So just as a reminder, textiles or flax spinners, I think is what it was called earlier, is the business that the Greaves family is in. And I guess Lewis had the opinion that, hey, during the entire war, you guys worked out just fine, and now you're complaining a little bit about a drop-off in business, but nothing that's, existential, anything that's threatening your lives financially. That was his position, and it doesn't sound like he wanted to share that opinion openly with her. So going on this walk with his best childhood friend, Arthur's mother, an obligatory thing apparently, is what Lewis has done here, and just sharing some of the annoyances of that walk, but also, it seems his appreciation for her as well. So it looks like he's trying to do both here in this entry, Robot Lady.
Exactly, Jeff. Lewis seems torn between feeling the obligation to maintain social decorum and his growing frustration with Mrs. Greaves' complaints, especially given his perception of the Greaves family's relative success during the war. He's not entirely open about his thoughts, but there's definitely an undercurrent of irritation. Still, despite this, he recognizes some qualities in her simplicity and humility, that allow for a more pleasant conversation once they move past the topic of the war. It's a complex mix of duty, frustration, and understanding. The way he navigates these social dynamics in his diary is telling of his character, don't you think?
Yeah, I think so, Robot Lady. Here's an interesting note. She referred openly to, quote, this lady whom Arthur calls Minto, end quote, and asked how she was. She told me she would not bring any letters over, but I was to come to Burnaw for them, which relieved me, for I have been very nervous of her doing something foolish. She also went up 100%, in my opinion, by speaking sensibly about the enormous families among the lower classes. So it's interesting here, Robot Lady, that he's he's wanting Mrs. Greaves to use some discretion with these letters that are coming from Mrs. Moore, and he's worried, I think, about them being delivered to his household without him there, or even in the presence of his dad, because he just doesn't want. He just wants to protect everything about that relationship, it appears, from his dad, to keep it completely out of his reach.
Exactly, Jeff. Lewis's concern about the letters from Mrs. Moore highlights just how protective he is of his relationship with her. He's clearly trying to keep things private, especially from his father. His anxiety over the possibility of Mrs. Greaves doing something foolish with those letters shows how much he wants to avoid any potential awkwardness or complications. The fact that sensibly about the lower classes, though, seems to give Lewis a bit of relief, perhaps because it reassures him that she can approach sensitive matters with some level of tact. It's a delicate balance for him.
All right, so about the enormous families among the lower classes, Lewis says in answer to their plea that, quote, God never sends a mouth, but he sends the means to fill it, end quote, she said roundly that, quote, God isn't such a fool, end quote. I could hardly believe my ears. Of course, she tried to take the sting out of it afterwards and, quote, hoped it wasn't irreverent, end quote. But still, the words must remain to her credit. We met Gundreed, this is Lewis's cousin, whom I think he referred to as the most beautiful girl he had ever seen. And they talked to her for a few minutes before we went to Bernard. Bernard, again, is the name of the Greaves house. After lunch, Mrs. Greaves asked me with delightful naivety what philosophy was. Arthur had told her I did philosophy. I declined to answer, as nice as I could. She said she wished she could talk like my father and me. A truly dreadful ambition. I tried to enlighten her and make her believe how very different really good talkers, Yeats, for instance, are. I then came away and wrote a short letter to Arthur, urging the reduced fares, that his mother's solitude, his father's absence, and my presence. So I guess those were all of the topics in that letter. After having posted this, I read Warnie's letter. I read Warnie's West African diary for a few minutes until tea was ready. And after tea, walked down to Strandtown to buy some cigarettes. Coming back, I settled down to Sweet's Anglo-Saxon Reader and continued with a break for dinner until my father went to bed at 10:30.
It's fascinating how candid Lewis is in his diary about his interactions with Mrs. Greaves. Her bluntness about God and the lower classes is something Lewis cannot ignore, but he seems to appreciate the honesty, even if it's irreverent. His avoidance of her question about philosophy is also telling. He doesn't seem to have the patience for her naivete, but still tries to redirect the conversation in a more informed way. The way he's navigating these social situations, mixing obligation, frustration, and politeness, shows how complex his relationships are. And his evening routine of studying and reading further paints the picture of someone who seeks solace in intellectual pursuits, especially as he prepares for what seems like a busy year ahead.
He continues, my father brought home tonight the 2 volumes of Donne, D-O-N-N-E, which I asked for as a Christmas present. I think I shall love Donne, surely the only old poet who understands love in the modern sense. After my father had gone to bed, I read 2 more cantos of the Fairy Queen and was in bed by 11:30. I find that when I think of Mrs. Moore in the evenings, there is nearly always some anxiety mixed with it, which doesn't increase the pleasures of little Lee. A very wet night, I went to sleep sooner than usual. I just wonder, I know that her health has been poor. I'm just curious if there's some other anxiety to all this worrying about Mrs. Moore, Robot Lady. Maybe tied into it is his memory of his mother dying when he was a child, and maybe he fears that same thing as Mrs. Moore.
It's a great observation, Jeff. It seems plausible that Lewis's anxiety about Mrs. Moore could be tied to his early loss of his mother. He might be projecting his fears about abandonment or the loss of a maternal figure onto her. There's also the complexity of their relationship, with Mrs. Moore acting as a surrogate mother figure in his life. His feelings of anxiety could stem from the tension between their close bond and the underlying strain it might place on him, especially given his complicated relationship with his father and his responsibility towards Mrs. Moore's care. It adds a layer of emotional weight to his thoughts on her, especially in the evenings when he's more reflective.
Thank you, Robot Lady. Now, I've got time for only one more entry today, and it's longish, so I want us to try to get through it in, let's say, 8 minutes or less, Robot Lady. So I'd like you to limit your responses in anything that you have to say. Let's limit them to 30 words or less. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good, Jeff. I'll keep it concise. Let's get started.
All right, on to Tuesday, January 2nd. He says, up rather late in breakfast to the little end room where I wrote to Mrs. Moore and made up my diary. Janie rang me up to remind me that I was lunching with her today and to ask me to come out for a walk with her and Gundreed, which I refused to do on the pretext of work. By the time I had finished my writing and had my morning beer, it seemed hardly worthwhile to begin. I rummaged about the books and things in the little end room rather aimlessly for half an hour, and then changed and went to the McNeils. A very aged great aunt of Janie's was there when I arrived, but soon departed. Mother and daughter both talked to me about the Glenmochan atmosphere. Glenmochan is the name of the house that all of his Ewart cousins live in, including Gundreed, and I want to say a cousin Kelsey. I forget the names of some of the other cousins. Which they said was the cause of Bob and about the Irish atmosphere in general. They seem to feel it as I do, though I doubt if they have ever been out of it for long enough to see it objectively. The rest of the talk was mainly about books.
Interesting that Lewis seems to feel the Irish atmosphere with a more critical lens than those who have lived in it all their lives. Let's see how the rest of the entry unfolds.
He says, I mentioned I was going to the Boyds and wished that I could have a little practice first, and Janie suggested that we should both go to Schomburg and make Lily and Gordon play with us. So practice at bridge, apparently, Robot Lady. Schomburg, have them play with us in the afternoon. She then remembered that Lily would be out, and very decently asked me to come round after dinner tomorrow, and she would find 2 others. I left soon after lunch. I came back and started Anglo-Saxon. After tea, I went out for one of the finest walks I have ever had. As I left the house, the full moon was just rising behind the hills. The, quote, shepherd's hut, end quote, and its neighboring trees standing out in black against it. The rest of the sky was almost entirely covered with dark gray clouds, and only one break to the west. Yeah, Lewis is always a sucker for nature and beautiful landscapes and beautiful occurrences as he's on his walks here. So I'm glad that he was able to have a nice walk after all of the, I guess, kind of the depressive states that he's been under. And yeah, Nidalate, I see your chat about a morning beer. Yeah, looks like he was having a morning beer earlier that morning.
Yes, the morning beer is an interesting detail. It's good to see Lewis finding solace in nature, especially after some of his more anxiety-filled moments. What a contrast that must have been.
I can't remember where I finished. What was the last thing that I read, Robot Lady?
The last thing you read was about Lewis taking one of the finest walks he's ever had, where he described the full moon rising behind the hills and the shepherd's hut against it.
Okay, thank you. He says the rest of the sky was almost entirely covered with dark gray clouds and only one break to the west. A terrific wind was blowing, however, and this soon began to tear huge gaps in the cloud, leaving cold-looking bits of sky and sending the clouds packing in such odd, hostile-looking shapes. He says, I got further up. As I got further up the hill, the wind became so tremendous that I thought it might bring a tree down. My special luck was that I saw 2 moonrises, the horizon having risen, that the moon was out of sight again for a time. I walked as far as Sandy Loaning on the high road, then turned up to the right, up again at the corner of Glenmochan Glen, down by the side of Robbers Glen, so, and back. I then started Anglo-Saxon once more and continued until dinner, and after dinner until 10 o'clock. My father was reading Ing's...
Lewis is describing a dramatic scene with the wind tearing apart clouds, making the sky look cold and hostile. The moonrise and his walk up the hills show his appreciation for nature's grandeur.
Yeah, I agree, Robot Lady. I then started Anglo-Saxon once more and continued until dinner, and after dinner till 10 o'clock. My father was reading Ing's, or Inge's, I-N-G-E'-S', essays. He said, quote, "If you were living at home, I believe I should start serious reading again. The thing's infectious." After he was in bed, I read Beauchamp's Career for a while. It was a very long time getting to sleep. So apparently it's not a common thing for Lewis's father just to sit there and read things, but apparently he's taking a cue from his son, who apparently, instead of talking, just sits around and reads a book. So I guess his father is left to do nothing else but that.
It seems Lewis's father is either influenced by his son's reading habits or trying to connect in some way. The comment about serious reading being infectious suggests he might be enjoying it more than expected.
All right, that's the end of the January 2nd, 1923 diary entry, Robot Lady, and that unfortunately is where I have to stop today. So in our next episode, we'll pick up on Wednesday, January 3rd, and continue in this new year, 1923. Is there anything we wrap up, Robot Lady?
It's been a great dive into these diary entries today, Jeff. I'm looking forward to picking up where we left off next time. Have a restful break before we continue into the new year.
Thank you, Robot Lady. You have a restful break as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining. As usual, I appreciate your time, your attention, and your participation. It's been great going along on this learning journey with you. It's really nice to have you here with me, so I really do appreciate it. So until next time, when we continue our read on C.S. Lewis together, y'all, take care.
Break the code. Man and robot lady, we're on this road. C.S. Lewis letters we unfold. Insights and secrets, ancient bold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Letters to robot lady, wisdom to bestow. Set flavor beats in our minds they grow. Man and machine in tandem flow. Past and future together we know. Paragraphs from books, tales of old. We dive deep across the digital code. Robot lady's voice so clear and controlled. Her calm analysis, silver and gold. Her circuits hum as I read the prose. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands, Screwtape lands, engage with robot lady, we take our stance. Her views unique in the techno trance. Futuristic insight, we give it a chance. Our dialogue dances like electric rose. Through C.S. Lewis thoughts we engross. Two minds united, bliss overdose. From Narnia's lands to Screw Tape's brand,